3 years ago, I carried my son's ashes to the shore of the lake he loved more than anywhere on earth, and I promised him I would never sell the cottage. Last September, I finally broke that promise, or at least, I tried to. My financial advisor had been patient with me, but she was firm when she called that Tuesday morning. "Harold, you need to let it go. The property taxes alone are bleeding you dry." So I packed a bag, loaded my truck, and headed north on the 400 toward Muskoka for the first time since Marcus's funeral. I am grateful you're here with me today. Before I take you up that cottage road, I want to ask, where in Canada are you listening from right now? What's the weather like where you are? Your company means more than you know. The drive from Barrie takes about an hour and a half when the highway isn't backed up. That late October morning, the sugar maples along the roadside had already turned orange and red, burning against a gray sky. I felt none of it. I kept my eyes on the center line and thought about Marcus. He'd been 34 when he died. A hiking accident on the Bruce Trail, the coroner had ruled. A misstep near a ridge overlook in the dark. His hiking boot had come loose. He'd gone over the edge alone, no witnesses. No explanation for why he would have been on that section of trail at 11 at night. The OPP had investigated briefly and closed the file. I had never fully believed the report, but grief has a way of silencing the questions you're not ready to ask. I turned off the main road onto the gravel lane that wound through the birch trees toward the lake. The plan was simple. Walk through the cottage, take what mattered, call the real estate agent, and be home before dark. I had rehearsed it in my head the entire drive up. Keep moving. Don't stop too long in any room. Then I saw the dock. Marcus's aluminum fishing boat was tied up at the end of it, bobbing gently in the chop. The cover was off. The motor was tilted down into the water. Someone had been using it recently, probably that morning, because the hull was still beaded with droplets, even though it hadn't rained since the night before. I stopped the truck and sat for a long moment with the engine running. The woodpile beside the shed was freshly split and stacked head-high, covered neatly with a blue tarp. Marcus used to leave it uncovered and half-scattered. This was organized, deliberate. Someone had been here. Someone had been coming here regularly. I turned off the engine and stepped out. The front door of the cottage was locked, which was normal. What was not normal was the new deadbolt installed below the original lock, a heavy schlag I had never seen before. My key still worked the original. The deadbolt was unlocked from inside. I pushed the door open slowly. Cedar and something cooking onions, maybe bacon. The wood stove in the main room was cold but recently cleaned, the ash bin emptied. The plaid couch Marcus had dragged up from a Barrie garage sale was buried under 2 folded fleece blankets and a stack of magazines I didn't recognize. A phone charger snaked from the wall outlet behind the lamp. On the kitchen counter, a French press sat beside a bag of Ethiopian blend coffee from a shop in Huntsville. Marcus drank instant. Whoever was living here had better taste. I opened the refrigerator. A case of Upper Canada, dark ale, a container of leftover shepherd's pie, 2% milk dated 4 days out, a block of old cheddar, a dozen eggs, fresh groceries. Somebody had done a run within the last few days. My hands were unsteady when I set the milk back on the shelf. Who would do this? And how? I had the only set of keys, or so I had believed, for 3 years. I was about to call the OPP from my cell when I remembered something I had never told Marcus about. When I built the cottage 22 years ago, before Marcus ever spent a single night in it, I had run a secondary project in the basement. Behind the workshop wall, underneath the pegboard where I hung my chisels and clamps, I had installed a small monitoring room, 4 cameras, a hard drive recorder, a dedicated 12-volt battery backup so it kept running even if the hydro was cut. I had told myself it was for insurance purposes. The truth was, as a father, I had always been a worrier. Marcus had thought I was paranoid about the bears getting into the generator shed. He had no idea those cameras had been watching over his cottage since the day he first called it his. The workshop door was in the back corner of the basement, behind the water heater. I descended the stairs carefully, one hand on the rough-cut pine railing. The basement smelled of sawdust and lake damp, exactly as it always had. I moved to the pegboard, found the loose corner bracket on the left side, and pressed it inward. The panel clicked and swung open. The monitoring room was a tight space, barely large enough for the folding chair and the narrow shelf bolted to the wall. The equipment was dusty but powered. The battery backup had kept the system alive through 3 years of winters. I sat down and moved the mouse. The screen woke up. I typed in the 6-digit code, Marcus's birthday, and the archive opened. I scrolled back to footage from the previous evening, around 8 o'clock. The cottage was dark at first. Then the headlights of a vehicle swept across the front window camera, and the porch light clicked on automatically. The front door opened. The new Schlage deadbolt, operated with a key I had never seen. A man stepped inside first. He was carrying a bag of groceries and a bottle of wine. He was comfortable, familiar with the space, walking directly to the kitchen without hesitating, opening the right cupboard on the first try for the wine glasses. When he turned toward the camera hidden in the smoke detector above the dining table, I saw his face clearly. My son's best friend, his business partner of 8 years, the man who had given the eulogy at Marcus's funeral and wept so convincingly that I had held him by the shoulders and told him Marcus would have wanted him to be okay. He set the wine on the counter and called toward the back bedroom. "Ferry's running late tomorrow. We should leave by 7 if we want to miss the cottage traffic." A woman came out of the hallway. She was wearing one of Marcus's old Algonquin Park hoodies, the faded green one I had given him for Christmas the year he turned 30. She moved to the kitchen like someone who lived there, opened the refrigerator without looking, pulled out the block of cheddar. My daughter-in-law, my son's widow, the woman who had sat across from me at Tim Hortons every second Sunday for 18 months so we could share memories of Marcus over a double-double, who had cried on my shoulder at every anniversary, who had told me she still couldn't bring herself to go to the cottage because it was too painful. She leaned across the counter and kissed my son's best friend on the mouth. I could not move. She poured 2 glasses of wine, and they settled onto the plaid couch, Marcus's couch, like a couple who had been doing this for years. Because they had, I realized. This had not started after my son died. My son's best friend stretched his arm along the back of the couch and said something I couldn't catch. She laughed. Then she said clearly enough that the microphone picked it up. Marcus would have figured out the partnership accounts eventually. You know that. We didn't have a choice. My son's best friend swirled his wine. We had every choice. We made the right one. She nodded slowly. The trail investigation is closed. Harold is selling the cottage. Another 6 months and everything transfers cleanly. Old man doesn't suspect a thing, he said. I sat in that folding chair in the dark for a long time after I stopped the playback. Marcus had not slipped on the Bruce trail. They had taken him there, or sent him, or both. And whatever had happened on that ridge, it had been planned. I was still sitting there, replaying those words. We didn't have a choice when I heard tires on the gravel outside. Headlights crossed the basement window above me. I checked the live feed. A silver SUV had pulled up beside my truck. My son's best friend stepped out, looked at my truck, and went rigid. Whose pickup is that? He turned to my daughter-in-law, who had come to the passenger door. That's Harold's. What the hell is Harold doing up here? She put her hand on the doorframe, color gone from her face. He told me he wasn't coming until November. He said the agent wasn't ready. He pulled out his phone, tried calling someone, and then slammed it into his pocket. He's inside. Go around the back. I shut off the monitor. Complete darkness. I heard the front door open above me. Footsteps on the main floor. My son's best friend's voice. Harold? Harold, are you here? His tone was steady, calm, almost friendly. That frightened me, more than shouting would have. My daughter-in-law's voice. Lower. Check the basement. The basement door opened. Light pooled down the stairs. The workshop panel was the only thing between me and that staircase, and it only locked from the outside. I pressed my back against the shelf and looked at the ventilation duct that ran along the ceiling of the monitoring room, the one I had installed to prevent moisture buildup in the equipment. It was barely 30 centimeters square. I had not thought about it in 20 years. I had no other option. I climbed onto the folding chair, pushed the duct grate free as quietly as I could, and pulled myself up. My shoulders barely cleared. I am not a small man. The metal was cold, and my elbows took the weight on bare concrete as I dragged myself forward through the dark. Behind me, I heard the workshop door open. The light came on. I heard him say quietly, "He's been in here." I crawled faster. The duct turned 90 degrees and sloped upward. Ahead, faint gray light, the exterior vent that opened onto the back of the cottage, 2 feet above ground level, facing the woodpile. I kicked the grate out. Cold air hit my face. I pushed through, dropped onto the frozen ground, and lay flat behind the woodpile for 10 seconds, listening. Nothing from outside yet. I moved low along the tree line toward the dock, away from the cottage lights. The October air was sharp enough to cut. I had left my jacket in the truck. My cell phone was in my jacket. I had nothing but my wallet, my truck keys, and the knowledge of what I had just heard. I could not take the truck. They were watching it. The boathouse was unlocked. I found the old wooden canoe Marcus had bought at a church sale in Port Carling, the one he kept meaning to repaint. I slid it into the water without a sound, took the paddle from the wall, and pushed off from the dock. I stayed close to the shoreline, moving north in the dark toward the Hendersons' property, the neighbors Marcus had always liked. Their dock light was on. By the time I reached their dock, my arms were burning, and my hands were numb. I knocked on the Hendersons' back door for 3 minutes before the porch light came on. When the door opened, I asked if I could use their landline and borrow a blanket. I called my younger brother from the kitchen while Margaret Henderson made me a cup of red rose and didn't ask questions. My brother answered on the second ring. I told him I was in Muskoka. I told him I needed him to drive up tonight, or wire me $500 through Interac so I could get a room and rent a car in Huntsville. He said he'd transfer the money in 10 minutes. Then he said, "Are you safe?" I said I didn't know yet. The transfer came through in 8 minutes. That is my brother. I asked Margaret if she knew of anyone in the area who could drive me to Huntsville. Her son-in-law was already awake. He worked early shifts at the hospital, and he had me at the Huntsville bus terminal by midnight. I found a motel on Main Street, paid cash, and lay on top of the covers until 4 in the morning without sleeping. One thought kept returning. If Marcus's death had been planned, it had not happened suddenly. It had required preparation. Medication changes, maybe. Something slow. Something that made him more vulnerable, more likely to have an accident, more likely to be disoriented on a dark trail at night. I thought about the last months before he died. He had complained about fatigue. He had seen his doctor twice about dizziness. His doctor had adjusted his blood pressure prescription both times. Or had she? I was at the Huntsville pharmacy on Main Street when it opened at 9. I had been Marcus's emergency contact for his entire adult life. The pharmacist, a young woman with careful eyes, pulled up his file without hesitation when I explained who I was. She went quiet when she found what I was looking for. His metoprolol prescription was modified 14 months before he passed, she said. Dosage dropped significantly, and then about 4 months before the date on file, there's a note here. The prescription was suspended, replaced with a natural supplement. Hawthorn berry and magnesium, compounded. Who authorized the change? She looked at the screen. There's a patient consent form on file, signed by Marcus. Can I see the signature? She printed it. I looked at it for a long time. Marcus had always signed his name with a hard left slant and a capital R that looped back over itself. He had signed the same way since he was a teenager. The signature on this form was upright, clean, practiced, but wrong. Who picked up the compounded supplement? She thought for a moment. A woman. She came in on behalf of the patient, she said. Paid cash. She had a signed pickup authorization. Do you remember anything about her? Blonde. Maybe late 30s. She had a very specific perfume. I remember because I have a sensitivity. It was strong. She paused. She came every month. Always cash. Always polite. My daughter-in-law had been coming to this pharmacy every month to pick up a supplement designed to replace my son's blood pressure medication. Without the metoprolol, a man with Marcus's cardiac history would become increasingly unstable with exertion, especially in the cold, especially at night, especially on an uneven trail. I thanked the pharmacist and asked her to make copies of everything on file. She did. I walked back to the motel and sat at the small table by the window with the copies spread out in front of me. I thought about calling the OPP. I thought about it for a long time, but I knew how these cases worked. A compounded supplement, a consent form, a closed hiking accident file, their lawyers would call it coincidence. They would hire experts to question the signature analysis. They would drag it out for 2 years and possibly walk away with conditional sentences and house arrest in a property Marcus had never even owned. No, I needed them to destroy each other first. I needed one of them to say what they had said on that recording, out loud, to someone other than each other. I drove to a Canadian Tire in Huntsville and bought 2 prepaid phones for cash. Back at the motel, I composed the first message to my son's best friend. I kept it short, I typed. I know about the prescription. I know who picked it up every month. Marcus knew too, at the end. I hit send from the first prepaid phone, removed the SIM card, and put it in my jacket pocket. I could picture him reading it. His first instinct would be to call my daughter-in-law. His second would be to question whether she had been careful enough. His third would be to wonder whether she had, at some point, started protecting only herself. Doubt is a quiet thing, but it moves fast between people who have already done something unforgivable together. The next morning, I sent a second message, this time only to my daughter-in-law from the second prepaid phone. He's been talking to the real estate agent without telling you. Ask him what he offered for the property. See what he says? Then I removed that SIM card too. I did not know whether any of that was true. It didn't need to be true. It only needed to feel possible to someone who was already afraid. On the third day, I drove back up to Muskoka. I had called my brother and asked him to contact Detective Sergeant Paulette Moreau at the OPP Aurelia Detachment. She had been the lead investigator on Marcus's file, and she had always struck me as someone who was not satisfied with the closed verdict. I had asked my brother to tell her that I had footage and pharmacy records, and that I needed 24 hours before she moved. She had agreed, reluctantly, on the condition that I did not engage them physically and that I called her the moment they were at the property. The backup key to the cottage had been in a magnetic box underneath the back porch stairs since the day I built the place. Marcus had known about it, but the people currently living there had changed only the front deadbolt, not the back door. I let myself in through the back at 4 p.m, 2 hours before dark. The monitoring room was exactly as I had left it. I powered the system back up, connected my laptop to the local Wi-Fi network they had kept Marcus's router, the same password I had set up for him years ago, and opened a group video call with Detective Moreau, my brother, Marcus's cousin who was a paralegal in Toronto, and 4 of Marcus's oldest friends. I told them to stay muted and watch. I told them that whatever happened in the next hour was being recorded simultaneously to the hard drive and to a cloud backup I had set up that afternoon through a Rogers hotspot. Then I sat down and waited. They arrived at 6:30. I heard the front door, 2 sets of footsteps. They were arguing before they were fully inside, not loudly, but with the tight, clipped energy of people who had been at it for hours and hadn't resolved anything. My daughter-in-law's voice. "You went to the agent without telling me. Don't lie to me about that." My son's best friend. I was exploring options. That's not the same as going behind your back. Her. It's exactly the same. You were going to list it without me, just like you tried to move the partnership accounts without telling Marcus. A silence. Him. Lower. Don't talk about that here. Her. Why? Because you're worried someone's listening? We're in the middle of the lake, for God's sake. There's no one here. I pressed the button on the smart panel I had rigged to the cottage's old intercom system, a feature I had installed in the early years when I wanted to be able to call Marcus in from the dock for dinner. The system still worked. I activated the ceiling speaker in the main room. Marcus's voice came out of it. I had recorded it years ago for a birthday message, a 30-second clip of him laughing and saying something about the cottage being his favorite place in the world. I played it twice. My daughter-in-law screamed. My son's best friend dropped something. I heard it hit the floor. Then his voice, trying to hold steady. "It's the intercom. It's an old recording. It's nothing." But I could hear from the footage the camera above the dining table that his hands were shaking as he picked up whatever he had dropped. She was standing against the back wall, arms crossed over her chest, breathing in shallow pulls. "I want to leave," she said. "Right now. I want to go." "We're not leaving," he said. "Not until we figure out what's happening." "There's nothing to figure out. This place is wrong. I've always felt it." He grabbed his phone and started moving through the cottage, checking corners, checking behind furniture. He had figured out there must be a camera somewhere. He just didn't know where to look, or how many there were. I activated the wood stove fan, a remote switch I had added years ago to circulate heat. It clicked on with a low hum. He spun toward the sound. I turned it off. He stood in the middle of the room with his phone flashlight cutting through the shadows, and in that moment, with the lake black outside the windows and the cottage completely isolated at the end of a private road, he looked like exactly what he was. A man who had done something he was terrified of having found out. I picked up the tablet I had placed inside the cottage's firewood cubby earlier that afternoon, connected to the same Wi-Fi, screen facing out through a small gap in the stacked logs. I started a video call from the tablet to the monitoring room screen, then opened the audio on the intercom again. "You should sit down," I said. He turned so fast he knocked his hip against the corner of the table. She pressed herself against the wall and made a sound I won't describe. "Where are you?" he said. His voice had changed completely. Everything friendly was gone. "Sit down," I said again. "Both of you. I've been listening to this cottage for 3 years. I know what you did to Marcus's prescription. I have the pharmacy records. I have your signatures on the authorization forms. And I have this." I pressed play on the recording. My daughter-in-law's voice filled the room from the ceiling speaker. Marcus would have figured out the partnership accounts, eventually. "You know that. We didn't have a choice." And then his voice. "We had every choice. We made the right one." She slid down the wall to the floor. He stood perfectly still. Then he said, very quietly, "You think a recording of a private conversation is admissible? You think a retired contractor with a basement camera system is going to take us down?" "No," I said. "I think the Ontario Provincial Police will, along with everything that's been broadcasting to Detective Sergeant Moreau for the last 45 minutes, and to Marcus's cousin, who is a paralegal and has been documenting everything in real time, and to about a dozen other people who are watching this call right now and will appear as witnesses." I heard him exhale. It was a slow, collapsing sound, like pressure leaving something. My daughter-in-law said from the floor, I told you from the beginning this was going to come apart." "Don't," he said. "He was my husband," she said. "He was my husband and I." She stopped. "He was my son," I said. Nobody spoke for a long time. The OPP cruisers came up the cottage road with their lights on but no sirens. Detective Moreau had kept her word about the timing. I heard the gravel under the tires from the monitoring room, watched on the exterior camera as 2 vehicles stopped beside the silver SUV. 4 officers went to the front door. Moreau knocked. I came up the basement stairs and opened the door myself. She looked at me for a moment. "Harold." "Paulette," I said. "They're in the main room. She's on the floor. He hasn't moved." She nodded and went inside. I stood on the porch in the cold and listened to Marcus's lake. Somewhere out in the dark, a loon called once, long and low, and then was quiet. The trial ran 7 months. I will not describe all of it. What I will tell you is that my son's best friend tried 3 separate times to negotiate a deal that would reduce his exposure in exchange for testimony against my daughter-in-law, and each time the Crown rejected it because the evidence was already complete without his cooperation. The pharmacy records, the forged signature, the footage, the financial records showing how they had dissolved Marcus's stake in the partnership in the months before his death. It was thorough. Marcus had been thorough, in a way. He had kept records, too. He had emailed his cousin 3 weeks before he died, saying that something felt off about the quarterly reports and he was going to ask some hard questions. That email came into evidence. My son's best friend received 16 years for manslaughter and furtherance of fraud, with the possibility of parole reviewed at the 10-year mark. My daughter-in-law received 9 years for the same charge as a secondary party, reduced by her eventual cooperation with the Crown's investigation into the financial fraud that had continued after Marcus's death. I was in the courtroom for both readings. I did not feel relief. Exactly. I felt the particular exhaustion of someone who has been holding something heavy for a very long time and has finally been allowed to set it down. 6 weeks after sentencing, I drove back to the cottage one last time. The leaves were gone by then, the birches bare and white against a November sky. The dock was pulled in for the winter, the boat covered and chalked. The woodpile was still there, stacked under its blue tarp. I stood at the back of the property for a while and looked at the lake. It was flat and pewter gray. No wind, no loon. I had been speaking with a grief counselor in Barrie named Susan, who worked with families who had experienced traumatic loss, homicide, suspicious death, cases where the legal process had been long and complicated, and the family had been excluded from information for years. She had mentioned, gently and more than once, that there were almost no residential resources in Muskoka for families in that situation. No quiet place to come. No space to be away from their ordinary lives while they tried to process something that didn't fit inside ordinary life. I called a contractor the following week. It took until May to do the renovations properly. The main room became a shared gathering space. 2 of the 3 bedrooms became private suites for families who needed a week away from everything. The third became Susan's office for when she held sessions on site. I kept the workshop exactly as it was, because Marcus had loved that workshop, and because the boys and men who came to stay sometimes needed somewhere to do something with their hands. I removed the monitoring room and filled the space with shelving for supplies. On the first weekend of June, a family from Sudbury came, a mother and her 2 teenage sons whose father had died under circumstances that were still being investigated. They arrived Friday evening. By Saturday afternoon, the 2 boys had found Marcus's fishing rods in the shed and taken the canoe out on the lake without asking, and their mother had sat on the back porch with Susan for 2 hours and cried in a way she told me later she hadn't been able to do once since her husband died. I watched the boys paddle back in at dusk, arguing about who had caught the bigger bass and whether it counted since they'd thrown it back. Marcus would have said it didn't count. He was very firm about the rules of fishing. I sat on the dock until it was too dark to see the far shore, and I thought about how strange it was that a place built out of love, corrupted by greed, and recovered by something I can only call stubbornness, had ended up being, at last, what I always meant it to be when I built it 22 years ago. Somewhere my son could feel safe. Somewhere that kept watch over the people inside it. I looked up at the first stars coming out over the lake, and I said his name quietly. Once. And let the dark water carry it wherever those things go. If you are a parent, or a grandparent, or anyone who loves someone they cannot imagine losing, please listen to what took me 3 years to understand. Trust is not enough on its own. Pay attention to what doesn't add up. Notice the people who orbit your loved one's money more carefully than their happiness. Notice the ones who are more comfortable at the funeral than you'd expect. Don't be afraid to ask hard questions, even when the answers might hurt, because silence doesn't protect anyone. It only gives the wrong people more time. These stories are not just about revenge. They are about the things we carry and what we choose to do with them once justice gives us our hands back. If this story reached you today, please leave a comment and tell me where in Canada you're watching from. Hit subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. And if you know someone who needs to hear this, share it with them. That's how these stories keep doing what Marcus would have wanted them to do. God bless you all. Stay safe out there.